welcome everybody else here today. I'm glad to see each of you. I don't think I've ever told you this, but there's something that I'm actually really, really good at. I think that you guys don't know. That's right, Jacinto. I'm so good at it that I think I could actually, I don't think get a gold medal for it. It's not quite a sport, but pretty good. To the point where I think there could be some awards handed out, right, Ursula? And the thing that I'm super good at is that I have so many different ways and am consistently strong at wasting my time, right? Okay, so I want to assure you, this does not happen during work, okay? I'm not here like tooling around like the rest of, I think the statistics for the average American is that out of the 8 hours of work, 3 hours are frittered away doing all kinds of I don't know what. So I want to assure you, I don't do that in the office here. But where this shows up the most is actually all around my weekly sermon writing time, right? And I have a lot of tricks that I sometimes like to pull out even against myself. So sometimes I like to, I don't know if you do this, but I follow random trails on the internet. I think, oh, I'll just look at something, I'll read a little bit about commentaries and then I'll see something that catches my eyes. The latest thing was that, do you know how many ways those Japanese mothers are making those creative bento boxes for their children every day? The pictures are amazing. So I looked at all of those, I'm really attracted to food, so I'll be like, what? The 10 best burritos in San Francisco? Let me see all of what they are. So it's like the best burritos, the best donuts, the cheapest ice cream. I don't know what. So I just start going on a trail, and pretty soon, a whole hour has gone by, and I still haven't started the sermon writing. The other thing that I do is I read a lot. Now, reading isn't a bad thing, right? Ursula and I both like to read. Not too long ago, Jacinto introduced me to the Hunger Games trilogy, which I finished. I just had to read all day, all night long. Stephen would come in and he'd be like, it's time for bed already. But I would read. So yesterday was a good example. I really needed to finish up the sermon, and I thought, rather than reading things that I'm supposed to be reading, like commentaries, or I have 2 books due next Monday when I go to my RIM Academy, I'll read the novels that Steve lends me, right? I'm on a really good one lately, and he always says this one's really good. So I'm reading that, and another hour or 2 will pass, then I'll think, maybe it's time. And then all of a sudden I'll decide, wow, our house is so messy. Gosh, I probably should spend some time washing dishes or cleaning up my desk before I get to work, because really it's a nice desk will make writing the sermon so much better. My final one is, do you ever do this? You, in the middle of doing something, I'll say, an email must have just come in. Let me just go and check my email, and then, oh, look, I have a Hotmail account, so let me go check there. And if nothing's coming in Gmail or Hotmail, I think, oh, maybe I should look at Facebook. Find out what other people are doing with their time, right? So all in all, it takes me hours and hours to write a sermon, not always because I'm writing the sermon, but because I'm wasting my time. So you can imagine how the words of the Apostle Paul struck me today when I sat with them at the beginning of the week. The first verse from our pericope came, be careful then how you live, not as unwise people, but wise, making the most of the time because the days are evil. And I began to wonder to myself, Emily, I wonder, do I make the most of the time? Do I make the most of the time? Do I take hold of every opportunity to do things like imitating God, which is what Paul invited us to at the beginning of chapter 5, right? Imitating God, or demonstrating love, or experiencing and offering grace, or doing things that matter to God, right? Like transforming the world. Or do I waste time? Do I fritter it away? Now, I know for all of us, we all would agree that time is a hugely precious thing, right? I think it was William Penn, one of those famous men, who said something like, time is the thing that we all want the most, but the thing that we use the worst. right? Time is the thing that we want the most, but that we use the worst. So what do we do with our time? Does the way we use our time demonstrate our deepest commitments in life? Does the way we use our time demonstrate spiritual maturity? Today I'd like to explore how we use our time as one of the areas that Paul lifts up and points to as he urges and encourages the congregation to grow up. And with that, I invite us into a time of prayer. Good and gracious God, we pause to recognize your presence here, right next to us, right within us, all around us. We give you thanks for the precious moment of now. We give you thanks for the precious gift of time, to experience the fullness of life and love and your goodness. So we pause, oh God, having recognized your presence, having given thanks, we pause to ask you to open ourselves up. Open us up, oh God, so that we might hear something for ourselves, hear something for our lives, hear something for the healing of the world. May this time together truly make a difference, and may we make the most of it. This is our prayer, O God, and we pray it in the name of Jesus, the one who came and walked a way that showed us what it is to make the most of time. Amen. Today is the third week of exploring and reflecting on the letter to the Ephesians, or the epistle, as we like to say when we're being fancy, in which Paul, we were sort of looking at the second half, and Paul has been encouraging the congregations, the followers of Jesus, those who read his letters, to grow up. On the first week, we talked about Paul's plea to live a life worthy of the calling that you have received and to grow up, right? And we talked about how sad and tragic it would be if we had a child in our family that always remained that same size, never got any taller, never developed any new skills, never did anything new, but just stayed the exact same. And how sad that would be, not only for them, but how that's true for us in our spiritual lives. We also talked about how our spiritual growth or lack of it impacts other people. It's not just our business. Paul reminds us that we are one body, one spirit. We're knit together. And so when one person grows, wow, I know we all feel it. And when one person kind of just gets locked in and stays the same and kind of doesn't do the movement, we also are all held back to a certain degree. Last week, in our second week, we talked about talking, right? We talked about how we talk, when we talk, what we talk about. And Paul was clear that what came out of our mouth needs to be that which builds one another up. What comes out of our mouth should contribute to the needs of others. It should be experienced as a benefit or gift to the people who hear what we have said. Our words then became an arena where we could experiment and practice growing and maturing spiritually. I was sort of struck because at the end of last week we were talking about the importance of our words, especially with our neighbors like the Sikhs or the Muslims. And I was so saddened this last week because I heard that actually in Illinois there was another shooting at a mosque. And then another Sikh was murdered in Wisconsin, actually. And one of the things that people in the Sikh community were reporting in Wisconsin were personal interactions with others on the street who would say things like, there was a story about a man who pulled up next to somebody at the red light. And the driver turned and looked at the Sikh man driving and kind of cocked his finger as a gun and went, "It's not over yet." Right? Those are powerful words when we say them. And the question for us as Christians, growing Christians, is how will we use our words to do what matters most to God, to heal and make whole the world? And today we explore our use and relationship to time. Now, I have to say, time management, I don't know, are there any time management gurus here? People that read all kinds, no? It's a struggle for me too, my brother. But time management has become like a huge industry, right? If I just Google how to make the most of my time, something like 4 billion hits come up with all kinds of articles about how you can become more productive and more efficient, right? For the most part, they are telling us how to, this is really related to work time, right? I think for one of Stephen's birthdays, I knew he was struggling with time management, and so this is a great birthday gift. We went to a workshop about time management. He loved it. I want you to know that he loved it, and so did I. I give good birthday gifts, okay? But it's really a huge industry. And we think about, wow, time management as making us more productive, more efficient. Why? Because we want to be able to finish up what we have to do in order to do what we want to do, right? That's one of those principles when we think about, wow, if I'm really efficient with my time, then I can actually have a 4-hour work week, right? And I can go and do all kinds of other things that I want to do. The other thing that I think about with time management is also oftentimes we're thinking about how can I become more of a valuable asset at our work, right? If I'm more and more productive and efficient, that means I'm going to get promoted and I'm going to make more money. And I wonder if that, in fact, is what the Apostle Paul was pointing to when he invites us to consider making the most of the time, to become productive, efficient, to be able to do those things. Now, there are three contrasts that the Apostle Paul lifts up that I think help us make sense of what this is all about. And so I want to share those with you today. The first contrast that Paul uses that maybe helps us think about making the most of our time, the first one is this: be careful then how you live, he says in verse 15, not as unwise, but as wise. There is the contrast, right? Not as unwise, but as wise. The second contrast that he lifts up says, so do not be foolish on the one hand, but understand what the will of the Lord is. Don't be foolish, but understand what the will of the Lord is. And finally, do not get drunk with wine, but be filled with the Spirit. And those are the three that I want to explore today so that we, in fact, feel equipped with making the most of our time. So with that first one, making the most of our time has to do with being careful and wise about how we live. Being careful and being wise. One commentator wrote this: the word Paul uses for careful, I'm going to speak Greek now, okay? Very accurately at that. Akribos has a root meaning pointed. It's the word used to describe the Magi, those wise men who were searching for the young child in the Gospel according to Matthew. They sought him carefully, diligently, or accurately. The Christian walks in this age accurately, this person writes. That is, in a way that is without error. Such a pattern enables the Christian to be wise. Foolish Christians are those who either live carelessly with sloppy inattention to the prescriptive and descriptive details of God's revealed word, or thumb their nose at the wisdom of the world, hoping that something else will pay for their mistakes. So we might wonder and pause for a second, am I living carefully? Am I living wisely? Do I notice what my words and actions do? Do I live with, Steve and I have started talking about this word, do I live with intention, right? About how I'm going to do, what I'm going to do, when I'm going to do it. Am I pointed, just like those Magi headed for Bethlehem, following the star? And so we can sit with this question during this coming week, with each morning. How will I live carefully? How will I live wisely? The second contrast, right? Making the most of our time has to do with understanding and discerning God's direction and purpose for our time. It's been interesting because discernment is actually one of the things that we will actually take hold of in this coming year. As we talked about it in our adult Sunday school team, discernment was one of those spiritual practices that we said we actually need more skills and abilities around. But the question about making the most of our time depends on discerning, figuring out what God's purpose and direction is for us. I think we often ask God the big questions, right? I don't know, some of you might have asked God, like, who should I marry? Or which school should I go to? Or which house should I buy, right? The big question, which is the career path that I should take? But how many of us actually turn it around and invite God to direct us in just the ordinary, in the small things, right? I think the pastor in the 9:30 service was not preaching about this, but he shared a story about how a pastor told a story once about going to the supermarket, and he picked up 2 things of lettuce and stopped and prayed and said, God, which one, right? I don't think we're really talking about that, right? Inviting God into that level of the small things. But certainly inviting God into more of what we do on a daily basis. Somebody who described themselves as a workaholic said that they began to slow themselves down by periodically pausing and just saying, God, what is it that you would have my life be about in this moment, right? So we can then begin to discern, wow, how should I talk with this person that I'm about to encounter? How can I spend the next hour of my time in ways that are pleasing to God and beneficial to me and others? So the second thing is we are being careful and being wise, but we also need to discern what God's direction and purpose is in order to make the most of our time. The third and final contrast that Paul uses has to do with making the most of our time, having to do with not filling ourselves up with things that cloud our ability to make wise decisions, that cloud our minds and faculties, but actually being filled with the Spirit. Our young people over the last couple of years have asked me from time to time, right? They'll say, hey, Emily, can Christians drink? And there's a whole list of things, like can Christians do X, Y, and Z, right? And one of the things is, I think it was pretty common, right? Alcohol was pretty common in biblical times. In fact, communion is around wine, usually. But the interesting thing is Paul points out that it's not about drinking that is the question. It's about getting drunk that's the question, right? It's getting to a place where you're so filled that the Spirit is not able to direct you, but something else beyond yourself is directing you. And I think what he's getting at is the clouding of the mind, right? And I would say that it's not just alcohol, friends, that does that, right? Wow, we can think about things that cloud our minds are sometimes things like bitterness and anger. It just totally clouds our mind, and we can't actually hear or discern God's will anymore. We're just filled with that, right? It could be actually pride or something like greed, where we become clouded with kind of what we want, what we hope to gain, rather than keeping again the Spirit of God at our center. There are many things that make it difficult, that pose a challenge for us to being careful, to being wise, and being able to sense God's direction and then following it. So we have to ask ourselves too, do I have any habits that tend to cloud my mind? Is there anything that's a part of my regular life that I have thought of as kind of like, it's just kind of on the side, but that actually cloud my mind? And how do I invite God's Spirit to fill me? Now, as I was writing this, I was thinking, wow, who are examples of people that make the most of their time, right? And that really exemplify this, because I certainly don't want to leave us thinking, gosh, well, that's a good lesson, but how in the world do I do that, right? And as I was thinking about the examples, interestingly, the people that came to mind have been the missionaries that have visited with us over this last summer, right? Several weeks ago, there was a couple named Reverend Grace and Jay Choi who came. my goodness, just appreciating their presence, right? Their beautiful music. The strange thing was I was even hearing this song as I was typing my sermon, and I found tears kind of welling up because the music that they sang was so deeply rooted in the Spirit of God, and they were sharing that. It was clear that they discerned God's will at every turn in their life, and that they were filled with joy as a result. And it was clear that as they discerned God's will, walked in that direction, were filled with joy, they were making a difference. They were doing what mattered to God the most. The other story that made me think about it was Janet Lar Lewis, right? The mission liaison from Israel-Palestine who shared the story. She didn't get to say too much about this, but it's interesting because she shared a little bit about how the first time she went to visit that region, sometimes called the Holy Land, what she saw and what she began hearing so entered her that she actually turned around, came back to the States, picked up her 2 children who were in middle school at the time, sold her house, quit her job, and returned to a place that she did not know the language of, had no job set up, and had nowhere to live. Right? In some sense, there was a sense that was the way of following, having discerned God's direction and following. And I would say that she, is filled with the Spirit, right? Is so centered on the way God is moving through her and using her on behalf of United Methodists, of people of good conscience in the world with our Palestinian and Israeli brothers and sisters. I have a feeling that you have other examples of people who are making the most of the time. Not in the sense of like, wow, they're making a whole bunch of money, or wow, they're being so productive, but they're making the most of the time in the sense of Paul lifting up. So I want to just leave the sense of examples with us today and make the final invitation. We've been on a train, right, for the past 3 weeks thinking about spiritual growth, the call to grow up. And our final word from the letter of Ephesians is about thinking carefully about how we use our time. And so I invite you in this coming week to take hold of that, to meditate on it, to pray about it. Ask God, how should I use my time today, the next 4 hours, this week, so that the Spirit of God can dwell in you and work through you to make a difference in the world.